We are joined by Michael Singh, Managing Director, and Lane Swig, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael. So a renewed push for a two-state resolution at the UN Assembly, with France joining the wave of recognition. Is this a turning point, you think? Does this actually change anything?
Well, I think the recognition of a Palestinian state by these three countries, which, add to the more than 140 countries which have already recognized a Palestinian state, is in itself not a turning point. I think it, in a way, reflects the frustration that these countries have with their inability to influence Israel, their inability to influence really the course of events in Gaza. And it's aimed at probably their own public opinion to show that they're using the tools that they have available, and at Israeli public opinion to try to show that they are, isolated, that the war in Gaza is having international consequences. The real question, though, as to, will this end up being a turning point, is how does Israel now react?
Michael, I want to ask you about Europe right now. It's talking big. I stole that line from the New York Times. But the symbolism aside, of G7 members, which we just talked about, deciding to recognize Palestine for the first time. Beyond that, will the Europeans be willing to take concrete steps, like imposing sanctions and stopping arms sales, for example? We know the Germans are wary for various historical and domestic reasons.
Well, you're right. And Europe is not unified on this. Much of the world does recognize Palestine as a state, but many European countries, from Italy to Germany to Switzerland to Finland, do not. And so there is no real European unity. And even amongst those states that do recognize Palestine, there's a range of views on whether to sanction Israel or whether just to sanction, settlers, for example, whether to impose arms embargoes and so forth. So, you may see some additional measures. They're likely to be weak and not very effective, frankly, in influencing Israel. Some of them, frankly, could backfire. There is a chance that by imposing sanctions, that the backlash against Europe could actually strengthen the hardliners in Israel, could strengthen Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And I would ask you a similar question of Arab states as well, who play this two-level game of publicly supporting Hamas to a certain degree, but in private, wanting them out of the picture?
Well, we have seen condemnations of October 7th and of Hamas by several Arab states. And I think that, it's no secret that those Arab states, the Gulf states, for example, Egypt, Jordan, are opposed to Hamas. They don't like Hamas. They see Hamas as a threat to them as well. I think, however, their worry is that, ultimately, what Israel is doing in Gaza won't result in the ultimate defeat of Hamas, that the number of casualties we've seen in Gaza will somehow fuel extremism in the region. And so what they want to know is, what is the end game here? What is Israel's strategy? And I think there's a lot of frustration that 2 years after October 7th, the war still grinds on without an end in sight. That's what I think Arabs are worried about, Arab states are worried about.
Michael, many leaders are insisting that a two-state solution is the only viable path to peace. But is that truly the case? Should they be more open to exploring, other alternatives or other frameworks that might address the realities on the ground, if there's any?
Well, you're right. There's this rhetorical support for the two-state solution, but I don't know that any of these leaders are able to describe how we actually get from here to there. I think it may be, something that remains on the table. It may be something that remains an aspiration, but it just isn't realistic right now. And I would say that rather than focusing on what the end game is for a Palestinian state or something like that, what these leaders need to focus on are next steps: building a Palestinian security force that can secure Gaza, helping to end the violence and the conflict in the West Bank as well, and sort of building practically one step after another. And that might ultimately rekindle the possibility of a grander conclusion to the conflict.
Michael, you talked about how the Israeli response might shape or might tell us whether this is going to be a turning point. And this, in turn, is going to be shaped by what Donald Trump says and his reaction. He speaks later today at the UN. We know that. We also know he and Keir Starmer agreed to disagree on recognition of a Palestinian state. So do you think he will continue to be as magnanimous, or is he possibly going to throw a fit and threaten Europe, higher tariffs, withdrawal from NATO, that sort of thing?
You know, it's really hard to say, frankly, what President Trump will do. One gets the sense that President Trump would like to see an end to the conflict in Gaza. He's also talked about the need for Hamas to be totally destroyed, which, of course, is not something that is close to happening yet, and so portends a lengthening or a continuation of the war. One also gets a sense that he has been frustrated, frankly, with Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision-making, for example, the recent Israeli attack in Doha in Qatar. Yet you don't see President Trump really imposing pressure or trying to use leverage against Israel or becoming more focused on peacemaking in Gaza. And I think this is the sort of puzzle that U.S. partners in the region face. President Trump will tell them he wants to see an end to the war in Gaza, but you don't see a very energetic American push to bring about that conclusion. I don't expect there'll be American-imposed consequences on these states for recognizing a Palestinian state. The worry, though, is that Israel could choose to do something like annex the West Bank or parts of the West Bank, like the Jordan Valley, and that could set other events in motion that are quite negative for the region.
If Netanyahu pushes for the full control of annexation of the West Bank, what then, Michael?
Well, even if he only chooses to annex part of the West Bank, and I think the Jordan Valley, that part of Israel that borders Jordan, the country of Jordan along the Jordan River, is the most likely piece, there's a real risk that that causes the Abraham Accords, you know, the normalization deals between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, and some others to fall apart. And that would really set us back many years in terms of progress towards Arab-Israeli peace in the region. It also, I think, ultimately makes potentially a two-state solution harder and maybe even impossible, depending on exactly what Israel annexes. And so it could have very significant repercussions in the region.
Okay, Michael, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Michael Singh, Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you.